So here's what I have been able to put together from what I've researched anyway, about why it happens. So there's two reasons. The first one is being genetically predisposed. And so um, in your body, you have, in your DNA, is broken down into bazillion genes. Each of those little genes is like a little recipe for your body to make a protein. And so, depending on sort of what your recipe is, that's what makes you look like you look, have certain diseases, things like that. And so, with EoE, it's not necessarily one single gene that you have or don't have. It's the effect of a lot of different genes. So there's two main ones, but there's several others. So patients with EoE have a different, they call them variant, is what you would say as a scientist, of the TSLP gene and the PLAU gene. So that's the gene that decodes, right, the protein that calls the eosinophils, and the PLAU gene is the gene that pulls the pin, that creates the protein that kind of pulls the pin on the grenades, right, and expresses those eosinophils. And so it's actually been found that those two are in epistasis, and what that means is they regulate the expression of the other. So exactly how that works hasn't been mapped out, but those two genes are both very important ones. So if you have the variant in those, that's one thing that makes it you a little different if you were a patient with EoE. So both of those genes have a single nucleotide polymorphism. So this is a picture of DNA, and these are nucleotides that make up the DNA. And so a SNP, or single nucleotide polymorphism, is really just one of these little tiny rungs of this ladder switched out. Crazy, right? That something so small could be so impactful. So in both of those genes, they have one little nucleotide that's swapped out. And what happens is then those genes are turned on more often, and it makes more protein. That's how you end up having those results that you have. That's one reason, is your genetic predisposition. The second reason is they found that a really important protein called SPINK7 is missing. It is MIA when you have EoE. And so it is a protein that's made specifically in the esophagus. So this guy right here is eating some chicken, and he has EoE. And you can see this is kind of describing what that is. So here's your esophagus, and it's made specifically in the esophagus. And through a lot of experimentation, scientists have figured out that when SPINK7 is missing, these things happen. So the barrier that's created by the epithelial cells in the esophagus has spaces, and the cells are disorganized. So SPINK7 is very important in kind of keeping the frontline soldiers in place when it comes to those epithelial cells. When SPINK7 is missing, more signal proteins are made that attract eosinophils. So even more calls are made to call in eosinophils to the esophagus. And like I said, because they're leaky, and now they can kind of get in and wreak havoc. And more UPA is made to activate the eosinophils. So more proteins made that kind of pull those pins on the grenades inside the eosinophils. And so more can get there, and more of them can release their poison and wreak havoc. So SPINK7's really been a big discovery in terms of why things are happening the way they're happening when you have EoE. All right, so I have two different images that came from research papers that I think would be really helpful. I personally like pictures, and that helps me learn better, and so I hope that this helps you learn better as well. All right, this one was taken for a study that was done on the genetics of EoE before the influence of SPINK7 was really understood. And so this one just really kind of explained what we know about the genes. And so here is your esophageal epithelium, so the lining of your esophagus. Here's all the little things that you're eating or drinking. So they're called environmental exposure. So these are, the microbiome, the bacteria in the foods you're eating, even just the chemicals in the food that you're eating. come through. This is the gene, so this is kind of a signal for a gene. This is that TSLP gene that's turned on, that's pumping out signals that's saying, hey, helper T cells, like, come on over and bring some eosinophils because we got a problem. And so here's your helper T cells, and they're putting out the signals to get the eosinophils to come. So this is kind of what all these different things are involved in. This DSG1 is actually a protein that they found that impacts the epithelial barrier. So that was an important gene that was discovered too. And so this is the pathway. So TSLP comes, calls the helper T cells, they put out the signal, which these are all the signals. Lots of complicated pathways happen, and then more then eosinophils are called to the esophagus. Okay, and then this picture right here is the esophageal epithelium of somebody with EoE. And so you can see the little gaps that are in between the cells. You can see these pink guys, which are the eosinophils, who now can kind of get in. They can get in there, and you can see how more antigens or more things can penetrate that barrier. So this is what they understood about the genetics so far. What was really awesome about figuring out the role of SPINK7 is that SPINK7 is responsible for a lot of this as well. And so this next picture really shows the pathway of SPINK7. And so what that means is, first, you have a genetic risk variant in TSLP and PLAU. So we talked about those two genes that cause those proteins then to be expressed more often, or differently than would be expressed in someone without EoE. And so that's happening. And then for some reason, which scientists don't know yet actually what the reason is, SPINK7 is not made in the esophagus. So it is absent. You can put his face on a milk carton if you had that in your, esophageal genes. So there's no SPINK7. And so what happens then in that case, proteolytic activity happens. That means those cytokines, those signals, more signals are released. Oopsies. More signals are released that call the eosinophils. The dendritic cells can get access to more food allergens, or food antigens, which also could be allergens. So those things are happening all because of the lack of SPINK7. These are pictures of eosinophils. And so we know also that SPINK7 has something to do with increasing the UPA production. And so that gene that we talked about, somehow it affects that PLAU, which we're not really sure how. What happens then is, now the eosinophils are there, even more of them now can release their grenades, and even more of them can then release those little granules of poison out into the cells of your esophagus. And so SPINK7 is big and important in in the reasoning behind why all of these things are happening. And so for that reason, one of the therapies that is a promising therapy that is being studied is the use of, it's called A1AT, and it's a medication that patients could take that actually mimics the impact of SPINK7. So it kind of blocks some of those pathways that SPINK7 would block normally if it was there, but since it's not there, it can kind of stand in for it. And so that's a promising protein therapy that helps address this pathway. These are the main two studies that I went to help understand. Here's links to them. It's in the slides, in the slideshow that's going to be also included, like I said, in the research folder. And then here's just some helpful links for source information. So hopefully this helped you to understand what at a molecular level is happening and when you have EoE, so that as you build your book and you build your own education of others, you can make sure you got sort of the right science behind it. Thanks.